Good afternoon, everyone. Really good to be back with you again and to be speaking again with my friend and colleague, Fiorella Isabel. We're actually going to be naming these conversations critical perspectives. So there'll be, I'll put my Substack under that heading from here on in, and we're going to be creating a channel in the hope of doing these conversations more regularly because one, they're very cathartic for us, and two, I hope that they're useful for you also to perhaps lay out diverging views on the topics that are the most prominent at the moment and the reasons behind their prominence also. Fee, welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be back. It's been like a few weeks, I think, since we got to do this. A lot has happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it has. I wanted to start with because I know that you've been speaking on social media about what's going on in LA and the Trump mobilization of security forces there. Can you just perhaps give some background to actually what's going on? Because actually, me personally, I've sort of semi been following it, but very much in a peripheral vision way.
Yeah. It's kind of hard to pay attention to stuff that goes on in the US when there's so much like
Yeah.
happening worldwide. But a lot of what's happening there is actually very much related to the violence and intervention that the U.S. exports. So there have been a number, as you all know, of immigration raids to the point where the ICE agency, it's basically was created after the Bush years to control and surveil people, and that's the essence of these agencies, whether it's the Department of Homeland Security or the ICE. They use surveillance and they use Israeli surveillance more actually very effectively. And ICE stands for the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And basically, they focus on using technology from Paragon Solutions, which is it's known for its spyware and smartphone encryption. And it basically came about as a way to quote unquote counter terrorism, counter any sort of violent crimes. But this is all the precursor because with the Trump administration, we know that Donald Trump ran on securing the border, right? And he ran on
Mm.
essentially decreasing the amount of undocumented immigrants coming in. And a lot of his supporters really rallied behind that because they felt that things were getting crazy and people were coming in. Now, we all know, if you know anything about US politics, you need to understand it doesn't matter that it's Trump now. Obama was doing the same thing a long time ago before the first Trump administration. He actually built the cages where they were imprisoning people for Donald
Mm.
Trump to come and take them. And then Biden continued with these deportation policies that pretty much focused on deporting many Haitians and treating them in very, very problematic ways, as we saw the infamous pictures with the Haitians being basically saddled and controlled by these men on horses. And nothing has ever been done about this issue with immigration because it's an issue that essentially benefits both spectrums on the Democrat and Republican. The Democrats use it to say, we care about immigrants, we will protect, the immigrant people. And they do absolutely none of that. They actually do the same thing. And then Republicans use it to say they will protect Americans from the illegals coming in and taking their jobs. And so it's all a form of manipulation, and they raise money based on this issue for every single campaign. And in comes the second Trump administration saying they're going to go hard with this, and they start doing things that, in my opinion, do kind of place Trump as this president that is fascistic, because it's not just about the emotional, personal, or racially driven attacks. It's actually more about the fact that that is used to divide and conquer, and it's used to increase the surveillance state on the entire population of the United States, starting with, of course, the lesser thans, the people who are undocumented, but that has extended to targeting pro-Palestinian protesters. It has extended to targeting anti-Zionist protesters who say anything against Israel, anything that is deemed unfit of the status quo. And they've been using AI to target all of these, I guess, dissidents, you would say. And now, because of the situation that Trump essentially came in saying that he's going to get rid of all these illegals, he then started targeting people with green cards who have permanent residency status in the US and started deporting people not just to their country, but to this prison in El Salvador where President Nayib Bukele, who is extremely, in a short sense, very tyrannical when it comes to imprisoning people. There's no due process there, and that is illegal whether they are undocumented or documented. And you have the Trump administration saying that, yes, they are thinking about going after American citizens who have some sort of criminal record. The problem is because there's no due process, people have been sent and persecuted. They have made mistakes. They have pulled people from the
Yeah.
from just random places who look Latino. They've done racial profiling, and a lot of people who are Latino are Americans and have been for generations. So this has set off a situation in Los Angeles that is heavily Latino, particularly Mexican and Central American, and particularly from countries where the U.S. has had their hands on interventions, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and so on and so forth. And they have begun specifically focusing, of course, on Venezuela because a lot of the crimes that are being committed in terms of gangs are from the Venezuelan gangs, Tren de Aragua. And so they've created this mess where they're going after people. So there's been people that have decided to take protests as a form of resistance, as a form of saying, we don't want to participate with this. And they have gone after the ICE agents who, I mean, there are stories where they're just taking kids off of school and they're arresting children, and all of this has been happening. And so Donald Trump then upped the ante by not only increasing these raids across Southern California, but then calling in the National Guard because the protests grew in attendance. And so LA has always been the center of protests. I've lived there for 10 years. I closely followed on the George Floyd stuff. I followed before that, the beginning of the Palestinian protests. And it always ends with the LAPD doing something to kind of alter the situation and turn the tables and make it look like it's the protesters doing something, but really it's undercover agent provocateurs and
Mhm.
undercover federal agents. And it doesn't just happen in LA. We saw it happen on January 6th at the Capitol. And so this is very typical. You'll see bricks that are placed there. Who brings these bricks? The bricks have been traced to the LAPD, the sheriff's department. There are different sectors of the LA police force, and they basically try to stir something up to show that these are violent criminals. Now, the thing is, you'll hear the majority, and I posted on Twitter of this man whose girlfriend was arrested, and he said that the ICE agents were actually trying to get them to do something because then they can say, "Look how violent these people are," and then
Yeah.
unleash a certain escalate the scenario,
Hmm.
right? And If you've seen police forces in the world, and I'm sure you have, they're not equipped the same way U.S. police forces are. We're talking about
Exactly.
armory that's military grade,
They're
weapons that
Israeli
are not just.
trained.
Yes, that's what I was gonna
Yeah.
say. They're absolutely 100% Israeli trained, and they are so similar to the ones I saw in the occupied
Hmm.
Palestinian territories, and that's how they behave. And but they're usually facing 20-year-old or 18-year-old or something like that, who are completely unarmed. And I have
Yeah.
seen the police literally point guns. They have pointed them at me as a journalist covering this. They have pointed
Mm.
it at unarmed people who were like had their hands up. They have unleashed rubber bullets that hurt. They use
Yeah.
this gas that makes you have and makes it unable for you to breathe for a good few minutes. And they don't care, and they've arrested journalists, including myself, for covering this violence. And of course, they've had class action lawsuits with that, and we won. But
Hmm.
the point is, this shouldn't happen, right? This is the greatest country in the world. This is democracy, freedom, and so going into the what's happening there, it's essentially a mess because what always happens in US protests is you have not only the federal agents infiltrating, but you have government cutouts. You have people with agendas that tend to infiltrate. So let's say like the issue is we don't support these cops coming in and brutalizing neighborhoods and scaring children and blah blah blah. Well, the Democrats will take that and say, "Oh, we can weaponize this. Let's try to turn this into an anti-Trump protest." So what they do is they bring in people who focus on Trump and not on the violence that's been there before Trump and will be there after Trump. And they
Yeah.
take it and make the protest about something it isn't, just like we'll probably talk about with Palestine, right? And and
Hmm.
it's and it's purposely done this way. And then you have the right that sees, the quote unquote chaos, and they say, look what these people are doing to our country. These are all crazy, radical liberals, the radical left. And then, so it's kind of like, okay, so there's no room for nuance. And what I've learned from the years of being there is like everything is nuanced. Like there's so much that people don't see on TV. There's so much manipulation that goes on, and essentially that's what's happening. And what I want to say here too is that a lot of these people that are so focused on Mexicans and the global South like coming in, and they don't want these immigrants coming in and taking over the country. It's incredible how they don't focus on the one entity that's pretty much taken over our entire government. Like from left to right, there is no difference. Israel has literally infiltrated every sector of our government, of our industries, every industry you can think of. And we can't even criticize Israel because the same technology being used against these people, whether they're protesters, whether they're undocumented, is being used against everyday Americans who say something against Israel. And incredible that most people don't know that they are trained with the IDF. Many of these law enforcement agencies literally train with the same type of protocol. So I see a lot of people there commenting on social media that are like, "Oh, well, this is different, and this is just George Soros." Look, George Soros is one of many figures who puts in money for certain color revolutions. That's a fact. We know that. But it's not just George Soros. There's a lot of other actors here. And so at the end of the day, I just want people to understand that this isn't about Trump or Biden, because you'll always hear like, "Oh, well, Biden started this." No, it existed before both of these presidents. This comes out of the Patriot Act. All of what we're seeing now are the effects and the consequences of the Patriot Act and the quote unquote war on terror and the war on drugs from before during the Reagan years. We're talking about
Hmm.
knowing history in a way to understand a lot of the laws that are being used essentially to allow this to happen. And what they do is they have people focus on the other. So they'll put focus on the Trump supporters or the pro-immigrant supporters, and then they don't really focus on who's doing this. And it's the international, or I'm sorry, the national state apparatus, the intelligence and military apparatus that is in the US and is acting in a way to use this type of technology to control everybody else. And I saw so many people, unfortunately, a lot of commentators who live in Russia or who, are tend to see this, don't really know the makeup of the US and say, oh, look, like Trump is bringing law and order. He called the National Guard. It's great. Like, look at how he controls this. Like, it's good. These people shouldn't be doing this. And it's like, what are you talking about? Calling in stormtroopers. If you watch Star Wars, like calling in the stormtroopers and cheering for the stormtroopers to act against any sort of civilian is just ridiculous. If how do you even cheer against, NATO and the Empire? These are all the entities that protect the predator class. They're the
Yeah.
same, and people just create these random separations. So, sorry, that was a
Mm.
long rant, but I
No,
just
no,
had a lot to
it's
say.
fine. It's perfect. And I think also, I mean, I had to kind of laugh about the protester wearing a brand new Soviet flag draped over his shoulders, beautifully photographed.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sure that wasn't given to him by a member of the LAPD or anything like that at any point. But I mean, that's a bit of a diversion. But I think what is really also important, and people still didn't kind of learn how these kind of events work and what they're designed to do. Now, number one, of course, what's going to happen? This is going to bring in greater surveillance, greater crackdowns, greater military and security control. We know that Trump is using certain technology through Peter Thiel, who of course is Palantir co-founder, but through Anduril, another organization that Thiel funds. And of course, Thiel also sponsored Vance as Vice President Trump. So we're going to get into how Trump is effectively now opening the floodgates to Palantir, which is heavily CIA linked, but also bringing in an entire pre-crime surveillance system, a modern surveillance state. And these kind of events are exactly the trigger to enable this kind of imposition. Just as 9/11 was used to bring in, as you said, the Patriot Act, which has been used to effectively control populations, surveil populations ever since then, under the pretext of a war on terror, which is in effect, as John Pilger, wonderful journalist who passed fairly recently, used to say, a war of terror. Of course, terror globally has grown exponentially at the behest of the United States and its allies in the UK and the EU, the Gulf states and Israel, since 9/11, which shouldn't be any surprise if you're following the purpose of these events. And I don't think that this is any different. While there may be, of course, as you've described, reasons behind the events, the fact that the protests have been largely, from what you're saying, maybe not infiltrated except by the agents provocateurs, which is exactly what I saw during the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest protests in France, that I went to many of them in Paris and saw exactly the same tactics used by the police forces of wanton brutality, the use of the LBD bullets, the rubber bullets, as you mentioned, the
Mhm.
sound grenades, the exploding grenades that basically can, if they're exploded near you, they tear into your flesh. Many people were maimed
Yeah.
by these brigades, lost arms, hands, if they were close enough to them, and I witnessed that myself. And so I think we always have to look at these events multi-dimensionally. And ultimately, the direction of travel is greater surveillance and control and cracking down on dissent against, as you said, the predator class. And I wanted to talk about because Trump's first term, he gave out multiple contracts to Palantir, both within the military and intelligence sectors. And the fact that Thiel or Teal, however you pronounce it, is obviously funding Trump's administration via multiple avenues. Are we seeing an increase from Trump in the empowering of Palantir and the empowering of this modern surveillance state in the United States? And is this part of it, as I suspect it is?
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, so you remember when everybody was cheering Trump and Elon for getting rid of the NED and taking it
Yes.
all away, and we were like, no, guys, this is actually part of the effort to bring in Silicon Valley because that's what
Hmm.
Elon's role was, to bring in the Silicon Valley technocrats and billionaires that are all his friends and colleagues, and he did that. He actually took them in, and all of that power was centralized in the State Department, and then Marco Rubio was pretty much heading it. And Marco Rubio, of course, was a very, very fanatical member of the NED because he participated in it in Venezuela. And I wrote an article detailing that. It was lengthy and about how he was a huge part of that. Well, okay, so Elon Musk fulfills his purpose, and then we see this really gigantic fake fight between him
Yes.
and Donald Trump, and they're online going at each other, and everybody's just talking about oh my goodness, look at Elon, poor Elon, how Trump is just, ousting him, and they're taking sides. They're like, well, I'm with Trump. No, I'm with Elon. And they're having these fights as to who their favorite billionaire is. And it's like, are you people, it's just, it really created something in me seeing that. It's like, these people are focused on who their favorite billionaire is, while these people are selling them out to Palantir, to these technocrats, and to basically AI and data mining. And this was going to happen for a long time. A lot of us have been talking about us going in this direction, right? But here it is, front and center, being done by the president that many said was anti-globalist, that he was going to drain the swamp, that he was going to expose all of these these oligarchs and blah blah blah. But how could Trump ever have done that when he is an oligarch, when he is a member of this ruling class? He wasn't ever going to do that, but people deluded themselves into thinking, and the only way that the conservatives and the populist right, I would say, there's different categories, I guess, but the people that supported Trump initially went in supporting him because they thought he was outside of the Washington Beltway, and in some ways he was. He's a real estate businessman, reality TV star. He's not Obama, right? So they were like,
Mm.
okay, let's throw our support behind this guy who's like, he's different. He says it like it is. He doesn't really go around trying to like give decorative compliments to anybody. And so they're like, okay, let's bet on him, and he's gonna drain the swamp. He's gonna do all these things. And so they were the people that were most skeptical. They were skeptical about the vaccines. They talked about, the liberty of the press, about censorship. In the last few years, what liberals used to talk about in the U.S., which was, they used to question vaccines, they used to care about the free press. The right started taking that mantle and saying, oh, well, why is so and so getting censored for speaking out against the election? Or why is so and so getting censored for criticizing the vaccine mandates? So the right started doing that. They started questioning, they started talking about things, questioning government protocols. And then what happens? You get a second Trump run. You get Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to come in, the guy that, had just so many people behind him due to his work with vaccines and all of that. And who came from more of an independent type of crowd. The type of crowd that supported
Mm.
him was independent, and people went with Kennedy. But then because Kennedy went with Trump, they went with Trump as well. And so you
Yeah.
had all these people that essentially ended up supporting Trump, thinking, well, we'll see what happens this time around. We know that he, filled his cabinet with CIA drones last time, and this time maybe he'll do something different and he'll end the war in Ukraine.
Christian
Well,
Zionists, yeah.
yeah, and Adelson. Oh, let's put that aside. That's only one issue, Vanessa.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so they were like, okay. And then the only president I think that could do what Trump's doing right now had to be him, because if Biden had done this, all of these people that are currently trying to have the win the Olympics and mental gymnastics to justify what Trump is doing would have gone after Joe Biden. They would have gone after Kamala Harris. They would have gone after anybody who did this. But because it's Donald Trump, they're trying to say he's playing 5D chess. He's trying to do something different, whatever it is. But, to their credit, there's been some people that have actually left Trump's, MAGA, and are actually criticizing him because this is very big for them. They've been looking into this kind of thing. And of course, it took Trump to be the one to sell America out to Palantir. So not only is Palantir affiliated with Elon Musk, and it's entirely part of it. It was led to by this Musk's Doge effort, right? And
Hmm.
it's going to focus on the selling, on basically taking the pools of data information on millions of Americans and immigrants,
Yeah.
and selling this data, and it's very personal data, to Silicon Valley technocrats, to particular private entities. And Donald Trump signed this executive order uh, to basically under the pretext basically of saying that it was going to stop waste, fraud, and eliminate all of this user info, but it was basically do what it was doing, it was storing data of Americans under the federal government. So as we said, it was a ploy from the start, and they partnered to do this. They partnered with Palantir, and they Palantir basically builds these big apps and of course JD Vance has been heavily tied to that, and we know
Hmm.
that as you mentioned earlier, that's part of Peter Thiel. And they spent Donald Trump, since this second administration, has spent around $113 million with Palantir. And they are working, Palantir is also working on a new deal that's almost a billion. It's like 800 million almost with the Department of Defense. So it's very interesting that Palantir is working both in the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, immigrations, and which is deals with the immigrations and customs enforcement, and the tax people, the IRS, the
Yeah.
Internal Revenue Services. So that all in itself tells you that these protests, it's connected, right? Because these protests are basically giving them the excuse to continue to expand on this. It is no surprise to me that these protests began, and after the business deal with Palantir was made, after this partnership has increased, right? And you see that happening all in the same time. And now that that business deal has been made, it's obviously going to be used in this way, not just by regular police forces, but we're talking about the surveillance state. And this is
Mm.
the way that people who were once critical of the mass surveillance state, who were critical of First Amendment and Fourth Amendment rights, who really cared about that stuff, are being duped into
Mm.
supporting it, just like liberals were duped with COVID when when they said, well, you have to protect those around you, don't you care about other people saving lives? And it's the same method, just depending on the different issue. And again, it goes back to these people are all part of the same predator class, and they work from the same handbook, and they're using the same tactics, just switching it up depending on what's important to people. And all of this data, by the way, is going to be taking from every single department, including the Department of Education, the Social Security Administration, and pretty much Americans are going to be data mined to the nth degree while they're screaming against immigrants or while they're talking about, trans rights and all this other stuff. Like all of that is just going to be used to further promote a very, very encroaching surveillance state that I think it's already there.
Yeah, absolutely. And Palantir is the engine of that state. But I also find it quite interesting. I was actually just reading an article by Whitney Webb before I came on, that Teal was behind the funding of this company, Anduril, that is
Yeah.
creating this virtual border wall, but also supplying unmanned drones to Ukraine. So, this is the ultimate hypocrisy, isn't it? While Trump came in on the ticket of bringing peace between, well, it's NATO and Russia, really, but okay, Ukraine and Russia. Then basically this entire Palantir complex is, of course, sustaining the war against Russia in Ukraine. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Bringing in someone like Elon Musk, because even under Jack Dorsey, Twitter was effectively an outreach agent for intelligence agencies in the US, particularly on this pre-crime surveillance concept, right? Where even back under Jack Dorsey, it was identifying people who were going to gather for protests against whichever establishment policy they disagreed with, and identifying those people to the local authorities or to the police and so on. So, it's a very dangerous environment into which not only the US, but also the UK, because I can speak from some experience there, is heading. And not forgetting, you mentioned the fact that the IOF is training US police, and I'm pretty sure they began training some of the French special security forces because of the tactics that we saw them using during the Yellow Vest protests. But that much of this surveillance technology is developed in the occupied territories by the Zionist entity. And of course, that is one of the reasons. Not only is it a barrier state in the region and a surveillance state, an interference state, a military outpost for the US alliance, but it is also, and it has been, in my view, instructed to develop all of this AI technology, the 15-minute cities, the AI surveillance, of course, the genocide AI technology was manufactured in the occupied territories and used currently against Palestinians. And, while you might say, yes, but we're not at that stage, they're not going to be using this kind of extreme technology against us. Well, yeah, they are down the line when you reach a point where something you believe in becomes worth fighting for, whether it's related to vaccine mandates or immigration, doesn't matter. At some point, you'll reach your red line. Every single individual, in my view, and every country in the world is going to reach a red line. And at that point, that technology is going to be wheeled out against you, just as it's been wheeled out against the Palestinians and is currently being used by the Zionists to exterminate and mass slaughter Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank. And I think that's the danger. And I think also that people fail to make that connection, as you referred to in the beginning when you were talking about LA. People pick up quite rightly on certain aspects of what's going on, but they don't make that big leap to who is really behind this, who would benefit from the destabilization of certain sectors of US
Hmm.
society, right? And I think that's what we forget when we're given these distractions and diversions. We forget to focus on the direction of travel and where all of this is really taking us and who does it benefit most. Yeah, Soros, but Soros is also or the Soros network is heavily sympathetic towards Zionism and towards Zionist expansionism,
Yeah.
right? And so rather than focusing perhaps on certain individuals, focus on those individuals, but make that bigger connection. And I think
Right.
that's what is so important, right? And I think I want to also talk about Ukraine because, talking about Teal funding the unmanned drones production that are obviously going into Ukraine. And we know that the US and NATO troops are training the Ukrainians. Many of the very recent attacks carried out inside Russian territory could not have been done without NATO training and assistance. It's impossible, right? The recent attacks on the air bases far inside Russian territory, the attack on the Kerch Bridge, and other bridges, particularly railway bridges very recently. This couldn't have happened without NATO assistance. And yet, Trump is putting out statements like, well, Putin and Zelensky, that Ukraine and Russia are still arguing like children. We have to let them argue until we reach peace. Yeah, I what are your views on Russia's responses, I guess, by various officials to what are effectively um, terrorist attacks? Because there were civilians killed actually in the targeting of particularly the Kerch Bridge, I think, that of course connects Crimea to Russia. What's your view on the rhetoric that's coming out of Russia in response to what has happened very recently?
Well, Russia has been, as usual, extremely diplomatic and political. And I think a lot of people have convinced themselves that Russia is going to unleash some sort of counterattack that's going to be insane, kind of like they were saying that Iran was going to unleash an insane attack against Israel. That didn't really happen to the degree that I think people thought, mainly because both of
Mm,
these mm, nation states are extremely diplomatic and kind of walking a fine, tight line. In particular, Russia, uh, they have acknowledged that the terrorist attacks, including the blast in Bryansk that collapsed and a road bridge and basically destroyed a passenger train. And as you said, they
yeah.
killed actually 7 people, um, and they injured dozens. That is being looked on as a Ukraine-led attack, and among those attacks, of course, were the drone attacks that happened. And the issue is that the White House has said that they had no prior knowledge of these recent drone strikes inside of Russia. But according to Moscow and according to even Maria Zaharova, uh, they have said that this has been done with the assistance of Western weapons, and that there is pretty much no denial of that, even though Ukraine has not said that this is the case. But what we have is evidence of the past. You have the Nord Stream gas pipelines that were also clearly had Western intelligence fingerprints all over it. You had also different sectors of military intelligence. One guy, his name, he's a French intelligence officer, Guillaume Ancel, and he stated that there's no way that Kiev could have possibly, and this is echoed by just many people with common sense, that they
Mhm.
could have not remotely piloted these drones deep inside of Russia without the data from US satellites, right? So they would have had to have some sort of assistance because Ukraine doesn't have the high level communication systems to actually pull that off.
Yeah.
And this operation, though, screams of some sort of instigation because it
Hmm.
really doesn't change what's happening on the ground. It's not a ground military win. It's more like, oh, look what can happen to you, and look how vulnerable we can take some of your fighter jets. We can take some of your weapons. We can, take some of your aircraft. And this operation was called Operation Spider's Web. And Ukraine claimed that they destroyed a 41 Russian aircraft, but Russia says that that didn't happen. It was around 8 aircraft. So wherever, the truth is, the reality is it's not changing what's happening overnight. What seems that happened was an attempt to kind of get Russia to do something to counterattack, because this is done in the middle of negotiations. This is done
Yeah.
right before negotiations were about to happen in Istanbul. And so the thing is, they still don't get that Russia's not going to respond in this way. And I think even now, a lot of people expect Russia to do something that, they're very pissed off. They're going to go and attack, NATO. And it's like, no, I don't think that. I think Russia's going to um, show it on the battlefield. They're going to continue doing what they're doing. They're going to target maybe military, uh, strategic military, I guess, weapons depots. But what I think, that's the military aspect of it, right? But when we talk about the real politic of it, when we talk about the Russian diplomacy, Putin and the Kremlin have said that they're going forward with negotiations, that they're
Yeah.
going to continue having these conversations. And also, that's in spite of the fact that Ukraine decided to pull back on this proposal, the exchange between the dead bodies of Ukrainians and Russians, right? They were going to do this prisoner exchange, and they were going to do also the transfer the frozen bodies, and Ukraine has since pulled back on that. They didn't really give information as to why they decided to do that. But what this tells me is that Russia is really actually interested in resolving this, and so is in a sector of the US. What it seems like to me, there is some underlying scenario going on between Europe and between sectors of the US, because it doesn't make sense that you have Russia continuing on this useless proposal. Like, if they were really done with it, they could walk away and say, well, Ukraine has violated this, they have rejected this, so we, logically, we put out our conditions, and so now we're going to pull back. What I think they're going to do is they're going to continue fighting on the battlefield and then continue pushing the negotiations through. And I think there's some back channel uh, conversations being had between the Trump administration and between the Kremlin, because there has to be some sort of deal where Russia is like, okay, well, look what just happened. Look what Ukraine just did. What's going on? They're not dumb. They're
Mm.
not, I don't think they're this daft to see that Ukraine potentially used US or Western influence to attack, to have this terrorist attack against them. And they're just going to continue like it's nothing. I think there's just back channels being worked out. And I think Zelensky is, who rejected this memorandum, this proposed ceasefire memorandum.
Mm.
I think he's on the outs. I think that what we're going to see eventually with Zelensky is they're going to throw him out. I think there's going to be a shift, because I don't see how you can continue to watch Russia be serious about negotiations and then have Ukraine pull itself out, and the US, the architect of it all, acting as a mediator. I think a lot of people are upset because they see it as a clown show. They see it as like, how is this
Mm.
even serious? If Ukraine is constantly attacking you and you're continuing to push for um, some sort of negotiations, like, why are you doing that? Is the question people need to ask. Why is Russia so adamant in continuing these negotiations? Is it to merely show that they're willing to do anything to achieve peace, or is there something else being, played into? And I think that there's something to look into that as well, because I think not everything we hear or see from the representatives is going to be the full story, right? And as we've
Yeah.
learned from all of this, and I think um that's part of it, I think, with the Trump administration. I don't believe that the US is actually really interested in a permanent peace with Russia. I do think that they're interested in right now ending this for their own reasons, and so is Russia, and they want to turn this into some sort of business transaction and peaceful resolution. But I think in the long term, I think that the goals there don't meet. I mean, they're just, if Russia is seriously anti-NATO, if they're seriously anti, the corrupt institutions of the West, they cannot make some sort of bow tie deal with the U.S. and expect them to follow through. So I think this is a very critical moment for Russia. What they decide to do will actually impact them for decades to come.
Yeah, and I do think what it appears to be to me more and more these days is also an attempt by the US to weaken the EU and for the
Yeah.
UK to maintain the war against Ukraine because the UK has invested so much into the war against Ukraine that there is potential for economic collapse in the UK if they don't have some success, right? And plus the fact that, I mean, we know Boris Johnson previously scuppered any kind of peace deal with Russia, um, connecting back to the Minsk agreements and so on, right? We know that Britain has been involved. They were involved in the Nord Stream pipeline attacks, in the previous Kerch Bridge attacks. And I know it from Syria in 2016-17, when Trump was actually talking about withdrawing troops from Syria. It was the British that triggered the White Helmets to carry out the staging of the chemical weapon attack in Khan Sheikhoun in 2017 that ended up with Trump launching what was it, 59 cruise missiles against an airbase near Homs in Syria in retaliation for the chemical weapons attack. And then, of course, what happened is that the American military footprint actually increased in Syria and has been fluctuating ever since then. And I think the UK historical animosity with Russia is far greater than that for the United States. I think Britain historically has been utterly determined in restricting Russia's, as they perceive it, expansionism as much as possible, removing them from West Asia or the Middle East, particularly in Syria, was always a British agenda far more than a US one. The US was much more focused on excluding and isolating Iran and benefiting Israel and the Gulf states in particular in the region. But Britain was very focused on Russia. And so I think also what we're seeing now is that power play coming into what we're seeing. Even if we look at Pete Hegseth's latest demand on NATO countries that they must contribute 5% of their GDP in recognition of a threat from Russia. So I was looking today at that. So for example, Italy, they're producing, or rather they're spending in, let's say, military defense expenditure, 97 million euros per day. So that will increase to 124 million. It's a huge leap for these countries. And so for me, this is about, as Trump did previously in his prior administration, he put pressure on NATO to increase NATO countries or member states to increase their expenditure to match that of the US, which of course is a much bigger industry than theirs, in order to, in my opinion, to weaken the EU, in particular Germany. And Germany, of course, is reported to be sending ground troops to Lithuania, around 4,800. So while the US is apparently negotiating with Russia, the EU is increasing their presence and their very belligerent rhetoric, as is the UK, of course, and increasing this rhetoric that the threat from Russia is increasing. So it's completely contradictory to me. Right. And
Yeah.
so for me that demonstrates either they're all in it together and that this is some kind of concerted push to give the US plausible deniability, or it is genuinely the US wanting to weaken the EU and even NATO to the extent where the US maintains its supremacy globally. And Britain, of course, trying to at the same time put pressure on both the US and Russia to maintain the war because these attacks were, as you said, obviously designed to elicit a response from Russia, which has not so far been forthcoming from a military perspective, other than to maintain um, the direction of their military campaign anyway, right? So I think we're seeing now a kind of Ukraine is an arena in which all of these um, colonial powers are fighting for control and supremacy. And Syria and the Middle East is another arena also.
Yeah. Well, it's one or the other. I mean, I do think like
Mm,
there could be a potential to instigate Russia into acting out against Europe and then, having that excuse uh, to attack it. And I think that's what Europe would want. And I agree that this is where they're headed. It's interesting to watch the U.S. Try to make itself out to be the mediator and then see somebody
mm.
like Lindsey Graham, who was part of the
Yeah.
operation during the Maidan and in 2014, 11 years ago. And he's heavily anti-Russia and he's meeting there with all these European officials, and
Hmm.
then you see the U.S. try to say, we like Putin. Trump is saying he likes Putin, but this and that. Every other day, there's something. I like Putin, but I like Xi Jinping. But like, it's comical because you understand why they have Trump there. You understand
Mm.
what role Trump plays as, he's just this business guy who wants to make a business deal. And when you look at Russia, Ukraine, it is a business deal for the U.S. They really didn't lose out very much compared to Europe, compared to the U.K. The U.S. has actually come out pretty well from this in terms of the defense industry, um, PR wise, and the perspective of military might, obviously not, because all of NATO hasn't been able to defeat Russia. And I think that's something that they were also testing to see how they can use Russia, like if they should befriend Russia, if there is a way to kind of pull Russia in only to then spit them back out. And I do worry that some people here don't really understand how the US operates and how they being their friends is probably the worst thing you can be. And so I do worry that some people don't see it. I do think that people in the military see it, people who are very much in this for the ideological standpoint for fighting, the Nazism, yes, but also the the Western ideology of supremacy that exists. People who went into the special military operation with that, they see it. But people who sort of look at it as a pragmatic deal, as okay, now it's time to end it, bring in, grow the economy, whatever, whatever. I think a lot of people who think like that want this war to end, and so that's why you're seeing the Russia actually continue to seek some sort of resolution, and overall, and try to and to try to really to make Ukraine and understand like this is the best deal they're going to get, because I foresee that this could continue in its full term, maybe not, but it could be revisited for a very long time until the issue between Russia and Europe is resolved. Because
Mm.
there's clear, as you said, with the UK, a clear desire to control Russia. And I think beyond the UK's desire and Europe's fear when it comes to Russia's might and Russia's capabilities is the US's focus on China and how
Yeah.
Russia plays a role on that. And I think that's where we're going to be seeing, um, watching things develop in terms of China and how that's going.
Mm. Yeah, I agree. China is the sort of final goal, particularly as the US is concerned. I just wanted to finish today and coming back to Gaza and obviously the interception of the Freedom Flotilla or I don't know if it's called Madeline or Madeline. I've seen various different spellings of the name of the boat that was picked up today by the Zionist forces, and the 12, I think it is, activists on board were detained, as they, always routinely are, if they do attempt any kind of landing by boat off the coast of Gaza. Um, I always tend to have very mixed feelings about these, particularly the flotillas, because there is now a convoy going from Tunisia through Algeria and Libya and then Egypt to try and make it to the Rafah border crossing between Egypt and Gaza, and picking up young activists on the way from Algeria and Libya and probably also Egypt. There's also another initiative, which I think begins on the 12th of June, where thousands of people are gathering in Cairo in Egypt in order to march to the Rafah border. And, I think my feeling always is I celebrate any kind of collective action or movement towards that is driven by a desire to defend humanity in any situation. And obviously in Palestine, it's the worst of the worst. It's an ongoing extermination that's been ongoing for 100 years. But I think, again, we have to have a critical perspective on this. I think where I would have issues, and there's a number of good resistance channels that have raised these points, when you have as the kind of the icon of the Freedom Flotilla being Greta Thunberg, who of course represents the WEF and Agenda 2030 and climate change measures being brought in again to control society and introduce surveillance and so on, and restriction on movement, and those measures are being deployed against Palestinians. And she and others on board the flotilla both do not support armed resistance. They actually condemn armed resistance, which is enshrined in international law, that resistance is absolutely legitimate when it's against an occupying force that is brutalizing a population under its unlawful control. And also those among them who condemn Iran for alleged human rights abuses, going back to the weaponization of women's rights, which of course is always a very popular moniker for the neo-colonialist entities to criminalize or demonize a target nation. Or against Syria, I have a problem with that. Because if you're going to color your support of a resistance movement through your own Western-centric prism, you're not supporting the resistance, you're not supporting Palestinians. You're effectively reducing the agency of the people of this region to protect and defend themselves. And so while I do have sympathy and support for, as I said, any kind of collective movement that is driven by a very humane desire to prevent genocide or prevent human rights abuses that are being committed, in this case, by the Zionist entity, which of course was created and sustained by the West. I do have to raise those issues, and I do have to say that we as Westerners, however genuine our support is for this region and for the resistance in this region, if you don't support armed resistance and if you don't support the countries that support the resistance wholeheartedly, you're doing a disservice, in my opinion, to the resistance here that have sacrificed hundreds of thousands of their own. And that includes in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, um, and so much more to effectively wage a war of attrition against the Zionist entity for the last 100 years. I mean, I don't know what your feeling is, but I don't want to be negative about these initiatives, but I do want to say that, and I put myself also under that category of I have to be careful that what I'm doing fully supports what the people of the region are sacrificing to to defend their very existence, their cultural identity, and their civilization against what is an occupying force imposed upon them by the West and expanding into territory, destroying homes, infrastructure, massacring families across the region, because they come first. So I don't know. Sorry, that was a bit of a a rant from my side, but I had this kind of discussion with a group of really lovely, dedicated activists that are here in Lebanon right now. And I understand that people sometimes feel a bit offended, but a friend of mine who's from here actually said to them, you have to ask the question of yourselves, what are you prepared to sacrifice to prevent the genocide? And it's a very important question because if you're not prepared, like for example, she laid it out. She said, if you're not prepared to lose your job, go to one of the sit-ins or the protests, whatever, which is low risk. If you're prepared to lose your job, go to XYZ. Do you know what I mean? If you're prepared to be in prison for what you believe in, do something direct like Palestine Action. Actually, go and attack the weapons manufacturers in the US or the UK or the EU. Do take direct action because then you are going to face the consequences of that. And yes, to a degree, the flotillas are direct action. The convoys are direct action. The marches are direct action. But I think we have to do it in full solidarity with what the people of the region need to do to defend themselves. That's my bottom line on it.
I think this goes back to the lack of Westerners, activists, protesters from all around, not understanding armed resistance and the significance of that for
Mm,
people who have no other choice but to resist via armed resistance, via this type of resistance that they can't imagine because they've never had to. And I think it's also a question of privilege. If you're a Western activist, no matter how well meaning you are or how aware you are, or educated, you have a privilege that these people don't have, where you get to go home after visiting these places and live your life away from bombs, away from sanctions, away from destruction, away from Israel, coming in and killing your entire family. And I think it really is difficult for people to understand that to me, it's a huge difference between being a pacifist and being an actual anti-imperialist or even being anti-war. Because if you're just anti-war and you're just against any war, but you don't understand that revolutions and wars need to happen because people who are oppressed and struggling need to fight back against their oppressors, and that is a part of their right to do that. Then it's not enough for me. You must be an anti-imperialist and understand what that is. And I'm not trying to necessarily create more labels, but what I mean by that is really understand what the level of imperialism the West has placed on people is, and what it's caused, and what it's forced them to do. If you're born into genocide, you don't have a choice. You either
Yeah,
die or you fight back. And it is that simple and at the same time that complex for others to understand. And so when I see something like the flotilla, I think I have even a more negative perspective than you. I see it as a PR stunt a lot of the time. I see it as a focus on a lot of the people on the flotilla rather than on
yeah,
what they're actually doing to help them. And I'm not saying every single person there is bad or every single person should be discarded or that they're not doing anything at all. I think it's fine. It's something, and I wouldn't be opposed to people doing it, but it's become, for example, in this flotilla about Greta Thunberg and the
exactly.
Israelis targeting her because she's a name in activism and all of that. And it's also become the other end of the spectrum where people who hate like Soros and who don't like her for her views on environmentalism have made it out to be, oh, the Palestinian cause is entirely co-opted because Greta Thunberg is on this flotilla. So it's one or the other. And
Yeah.
again, we're stuck in the realm of nuance and the realm of reality and truth, trying to fight all of these things coming at us. And at the end of the day, we end up discussing these things and not doing anything to actually help people dying right now in Gaza. And so that's what irritates me about it. It becomes more about, ooh, who are these activists? That's so great. They're doing so much. Okay. But what exactly is actually changing as a result of this? And why is Israel giving them sandwiches while, it's kind of
Well,
just a
actually, I mean, it's a
mockery.
distraction. It's an actual distraction because if
Yeah,
you look at social media now, everyone's focused on this. Even
yes.
Francesca Albanese is making statements about Madeleine. The Turkish government is demanding, the release of the activists and so on. And the
Yeah,
Spanish government is, well, hold on. I think it was since dawn this morning, another 42 Palestinians, at least, were massacred in Gaza under Zionist bombs. And, we don't know how many more children are dying from starvation, how many more guys who are being forced to queue for humanitarian aid and are being shot by ISIS that is being funded by Netanyahu inside Gaza to turn on the civilians there and against the armed resistance, right? So we're getting distracted from that. No, I'm not saying no
Exactly.
one's paying attention to it, but everyone is focused on what's happened to the Madeleine. And that was always going to be the case. Like any flotilla that sets off is going to be, it's going to meet the same fate,
Yeah.
right? And all
It
the
just
money
seems
that gets
showmanship.
poured into that, right, that could actually, in my opinion, be, for example, sent to the families in Gaza or in Lebanon or anywhere, or in Yemen, anywhere in the world where people are literally dying to resist Zionism. And of course, we talked about this morning, there are in Iran families that are literally queuing up to sell their family gold, which, it's very important. It's like us giving up our savings accounts to provide aid for people in Palestine. And yet this is never talked about. The focus is always on women's rights and the forced hijab, which is another complete, fantasy
Yeah.
created in the West. But this isn't focused on. And so I think, again, it's this Western centric funneling of narratives away from what the
Yeah.
actual resistance is doing in Lebanon, for example, or even still in Syria or in Iraq or in Yemen or in Iran to actively prevent and help those who have been targeted by the Zionist genocide. And yet we're supposed to focus on, as you said, Greta Thunberg. I mean, I watched a video this morning where they had, I think, a couple of minutes of her talking, and then all the other activists literally only introduced themselves and they were cut off. So it is very focused on her. And so then it becomes a political message, in my opinion, because she's always been weaponized to put
Yeah.
forward Western-centric WEF style, UN style agendas. That's her role, whether she's wittingly or unwittingly. And I do recommend everybody go and read Cory Morningstar's series on Greta Thunberg to fully understand to what extent she's been exploited by the predator class to push through their agendas. And sadly, um, as you said, many people are going to see this as a politicized move, despite the fact that there are other activists involved in it that probably do have very good motives for doing it. And this is always the problem. As you said, there's multiple agendas at play. And I think trying to decipher all of them is a difficult task, but it has to be done because people get carried away by this kind of thing. But as I said, it then becomes a distraction and a diversion away from what we should really be focused on.
Yeah, and just the last thing I want to say on that
Mm,
is, Greta, just like pretty much when any organization delegation takes Western influencers, it becomes about them
yeah,
holding the voice of Palestinians and elevating it instead of elevating Palestinians themselves,
yeah,
or doing something directly with Palestinians. It's like once again you're relying on the Western face to get you to where you need to be. And I get the concept
exactly.
of, well, it's going to get the attention, but the attention of what? It's going to get people talking about something but doing nothing and ignoring the actual problem. So it really doesn't do much for the cause as I think people think it does. And so that's another underlying problem I see in a lot of the activist movements, or the movements that are trying to get a certain cause out, thinking that they need these Western faces. And I don't want to necessarily go too deeply in on that, but it becomes also about the Jewish faces, the Jewish so-called anti-Zionist faces that,
Yeah,
have something to say. And then it's like, well, you highlight them because they're Jewish and they're anti-Zionist, but then, like, how far does that go? And like, why do you need the them and their faces to highlight, the Palestinian cause? Like, it just goes back to understanding that I don't think this is the way to go. And look, we're not going to sit here and berate these people for trying to
no,
do
absolutely not.
something, but at the same time, it really doesn't change what's happening. As you said, people are still dying right now. Um, there needs to be an understanding that a lot of people like Greta, and not just her, but a lot of people like that, they are there to basically bring in and pacify the idea of armed resistance. They're there to bring
Mm,
in the idea that international law and diplomacy is the way to go. And it may be the way to go for other countries and other peoples and, a lot of things happening in the world, but it is not the way to go for a Holocaust. It is not the way to go for a genocide. There's no
mm.
diplomacy in that. And I'm sick of people trying to make it about diplomacy. I saw a post by Scott Ritter recently, and I had to go off because it was about that shooting that happened a few weeks ago. And, saying this, it was just said in a very Western centric, arrogant way that this is, you can't tie the cause to this. The cause is just off if you do this. There's no excuse for violence. And the thing is, like, this level of just anger over one one event. I don't want to say isolated because it's not necessarily isolated in the grand scheme of things, but one event where two Zionists were killed um, by somebody who was apparently pro-Palestinian does not does not deserve that level of anger when we have a genocide happening and when people are being told they shouldn't be violent, when there is a Holocaust happening and every single option has been used. So try
Yeah.
diplomacy, tried international law, tried this or that. And Yemen, of course, among other resistance factions, and Ansarallah, they are, doing the thing that they should be doing by attacking these ships and going at it in an economic way, in a military way. But everybody else just doesn't want to touch that. They just can't do it because they're like, well, it'll be used back on us. And it's like, well, it always is. It doesn't matter. It's already being used back on the people that are on the receiving end of it. We aren't. So again,
Exactly.
this is goes back to not understanding what that means and how these people live. They don't have the opportunity nor the privilege of denying armed resistance. This is all they have. And nobody else is going to come save them but themselves and the people of the resistance. So it's insulting to promote this idea that only through diplomacy and legality, when you recognize the state of Israel, when you recognize them as being some, an actual country or a nation, when they are not. And so
Mm.
everything that exists forth from that is irrelevant to me at that point, because your laws and your regulations, they don't represent the truth. So for me, that's where
Yeah.
it's at.
And I think, just a personal anecdote. A couple of days ago, we were sitting having dinner on the Beirut coastline, and Israel issued a warning in the southern suburb of Beirut to evacuate, I think it was 4 areas, including close to a school, because they were going to bomb. And our friends had to literally, in about 20 minutes, find an Uber to go to the house in the southern suburb, grab their family, and bring them to safety where we were. Right? This is what life is when you're dealing with the Zionist entity. They negotiated a ceasefire back in November before they aided and abetted the international coup against Syria. And they've violated every single hour of every single day. They've violated that ceasefire, including the most recent bombing of residential areas in Dahieh in the southern suburbs of Beirut. And even the Lebanese army, which is very much under the control of the US and the sponsorship of the US, actually went against the international committee and said to Israel, look, we will go to the buildings you're talking about and prove to you that there are no weapons, there are no militants in these buildings. And Israel refused. They bombed anyway, despite the reassurances of the Lebanese army, right? So this is what we're dealing with. And this is on a very small scale. Every day they're killing civilians and shooting civilians in the south on their farms, on their land, trying to come back to their homes. We're still looking for martyrs in the south after they invaded last year. So I think just for people to understand what it means, what diplomacy means with Israel, it means nothing. Absolutely nothing, right? It's just a method for them to maintain and sustain the extermination of Palestinians. That's it.
And to make them look human as they are doing the most
Yeah,
inhumane type
yeah.
of
And that's
destruction.
and yeah, and that's also demonstrated by the PR of handing out sandwiches to the activists on the boat. And this is what they do. That's on a microcosm scale, on a macro scale, that's what they do under international law. So international law is devoid of any legitimacy, in my opinion,
Yeah.
because it's done nothing in 100 years to stop what is happening and has intensified since October the 7th. So relying on that for anything is completely insane. And the resistance largely doesn't actually need aid. Palestinians would rather have their nation state and their independence and their justice than aid. That's another thing that people forget. When people amplify countries' efforts of sending in aid. It's nothing. It's like putting an elastoplast on an open wound. You're not healing the wound, you're just covering it for a period of time. You're treating symptoms, not cause.
Right.
And that's what international law does, and that's what the majority of countries in the world today that have the power to actually take action in the same way that Yemen has by boycotting and economically targeting Israel. And yet they won't do it because of their own interests. God
Well,
bless Yemen.
well, yeah. Then
You
that's a
know,
way to end it there.
I think so. All right, Fee, thank you so much for coming on again. It was really cathartic. Just let people know where they can find you.
Sure. Y'all can find me on my Substack. I have an article on Russia coming out soon, adding a lot of things that have been happening. And you can also find me at Fiorella in Moscow on Telegram and Fiorella Isabel M on Twitter slash X, whatever. And yeah, and like I said, we're like Vanessa said earlier, we'll be working on putting this stuff on YouTube,
Yeah.
maybe videos.
Mm. Yeah, when
And
I
yeah,
finally get organized properly. I am working on it, on getting this turned into a proper kind of studio, but it takes a bit of time. But yeah, we will,
yeah.
and certainly at Substack there'll be a section on critical perspectives, and we are going to be doing this as regularly as we possibly can with all of our commitments to our work also. But thank you all for listening, watching, reading. Fee, speak to you very soon, and please take care. I know you've been suffering a bit, but I hope you feel better soon.
Thank you.
Take care.